I mean, the things that he's doing is not trying to make America better. He's ruining our infrastructure, every department in our government. He's ruining, and he's right now destroying our economy. He's taken away all of our allies. We're a pariah in the world.
When Donald Trump announced in January 2023 that he would impose a 25% tariff on all cars not manufactured in the US, no one could have imagined how quickly this decision would blow up the entire North American automotive industry. It seemed that everyone expected China or other trading partners to strike first, but no one could have predicted that the first and most devastating blow would come from Canada. Yes, the very country that has been so quiet lately was able to turn the global economy upside down without firing a single shot. Before the US had time to respond to Trump's threats, the Canadian government, led by Mark Carney, decided to play its card, and, as it turned out, it was much more powerful than anyone could have expected. Within 24 hours of its signing, the entire US automotive industry was plunged into chaos. Suddenly, Canadian restrictions on minerals became a disaster for Tesla, Ford, General Motors, and other American giants. Factories slowed production, and what's more, a real war broke out at the border.
Well, this feels more like a Tesla-only story when you look at just this fall in EV sales for them, that they're suffering across Europe, down 45% in January. The wider EV market in Europe up 37%, so rivals are catching up and performing.
Imagine a situation where large international corporations are faced with supply chain disruptions, production stoppages, and rising prices, all because one neighbor on the same continent changed its trade policy. Supplies of materials such as nickel, lithium, and aluminum became severely limited, and the very production process that major American manufacturers had relied on for decades was threatened with collapse. Tesla, a company that was once a symbol of success and technological achievement, was now unable to deliver its products on time. And as it turned out, this was only the beginning of the troubles.
Running around on stage with the Tesla stock price, where the stock price had gone in half. And he was overjoyed. What an evil thing to do. What a creep, what a jerk. Like who derives joy?
But the most interesting thing is not even the economic decline of America. There is something much more important in this conflict: profound strategic changes that are gradually turning into a new form of economic warfare. Canada made a decision that turned the tables. Legislative initiatives, such as a 100% tariff on all imported Tesla cars, were not aimed simply at the economic defeat of American manufacturers. It was a political move symbolizing Canada's rise as a leading power on the North American continent. Now Canada was not only threatening America, but also beginning to emerge as an independent player on the world stage, challenging US global leadership.
Teslas are being torched across the country. Dealerships shot up and set on fire. Spray paint to vandalize and make a statement. People in Southern California are getting notes on their Teslas, calling them complicit Nazis for owning electric cars.
You might think this is just another economic war with the usual consequences, but there is one important detail. This conflict has become more than just a battle over trade rules. It became a battleground for the future of the global economy, where the winner could not just win, they could reshape everything we knew about global supply chains, trade alliances, and even power relations on the planet. Canada's strategy is not just a response to American aggression. It is a reimagined approach that could radically change entire industries, influence the geopolitical future, and even alter the planet's climate.
371, most were saying 350 to 360. Now they're coming in at 336,068. Production of 362,615. So for some point of reference here, you're going back to Q2, maybe Q1 of 2022 in terms of the last time that they had production this or deliveries this low for one quarter. So again, Tesla deliveries worse than expected at just over 336,000 deliveries in the first quarter. Guys, I'll send it back to you.
That's horrible. Can I just ask Phil, how about the Cybertruck? How's that doing? You got a little inventory there in the Cybertruck?
How exactly did Carney and his team manage to outmaneuver the US so quickly and effectively? What consequences could this have for all of us? And what will happen to Tesla, Ford, and other giants when other economic players are already waiting in the wings across the border? Watch this video to find out how a seemingly insignificant economic detail could become a catalyst for global change that destroys the familiar order of things. In early 2023, US President Donald Trump announced a decision that was supposed to be the final word in trade disputes with foreign car manufacturers. He announced the introduction of a 25% tariff on all cars not manufactured in the US. At that moment, it seemed that there was only one inevitable response: increased pressure on China and other countries that, according to the White House, threatened the US economy. The tariffs were introduced not simply to restrict imports, but to bring back jobs that, according to Trump, had been lost over the years of globalization. However, no one could have predicted that just a few days later, a country that had always been considered a reliable ally of the US would play a key role in this economic standoff.
Over the last couple of months. But the other thing that this could potentially be is an attempt at readjustment or correction by the Trump administration, in that one of Trump's closest kind of allies and supporters, and someone who's clearly very influential in the administration, is coming out to kind of push back against the recently implemented policies. So I'm thinking, or maybe hopeful is the right word, that this might be a signal that the administration is considering walking back some of those policies.
Canada, a country with which America has close trade and political ties, not only supported the new tariffs but also immediately took action in an area where the US did not expect a confrontation. Within 24 hours of Trump's tariffs, the North American auto industry was on the brink of collapse. The Canadian government, led by Mark Carney, took a series of quiet but strategically brilliant steps that undermined the US market in a restrained and entirely legal manner. Instead of provoking a trade conflict with the US, Canada simply decided to change its internal rules for the auto industry, which led to an inevitable domino effect. New environmental and financial checks were introduced in Canadian mines and factories, significantly slowing down the supply of materials needed for car production. The first to suffer were the companies that depended on Canadian resources, primarily Tesla, Ford, General Motors, and other giants. The whole world turned its attention to the situation when Canadian export restrictions began to extend to nickel, lithium, and aluminum minerals that were vital for the production of electric vehicles. The situation took a dramatic turn when, within a few days, Tesla faced massive supply disruptions that threatened to jeopardize orders for huge batches of cars destined for the US and international markets. At first glance, these changes might have been seen as a minor inconvenience, but in reality, they led to a real economic crisis in the automotive industry. The first disruptions began at Tesla's factories in Nevada and Texas. Necessary components could not be delivered on time, and those that did arrive were found to be of poor quality due to new inspections.
That's from the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. People just choosing with their wallets to not buy Teslas because of that Musk-Trump association. And actually here in London, an activist group called Everyone Hates Elon actually have been hacking bus stop signs with posters. I actually passed one yesterday. First, I wasn't quite sure what was happening, but it said the words 0 to 1939 in 3 seconds. Illusion here, 0 to 60 in like 3 seconds or something. But this poster was alluding to the start of World War II, and the image was of Musk giving that hand salute that we saw at Trump's inauguration that many have attacked as a Nazi gesture. Musk, though, has neither admitted or denied what he was doing. But we're seeing the knock-on effect of that anti-Musk anger across Europe and in terms of sales.
Production lines began to operate intermittently, and promises on car delivery times could not be met. But that was only the beginning. Soon, new logistical challenges were added to these problems. For example, Canadian customs authorities began conducting random checks on car shipments, delaying them indefinitely. Ports in Ontario and British Columbia, without changing their official policy, began to change their internal priority structure. They now gave preference to their own businesses, while foreign cargo was delayed. Fewer and fewer components for car assembly began to reach foreign markets, posing a serious threat not only to Tesla but also to other American brands such as Ford and GM. Suppliers began to raise prices and, more importantly, delivery times increased dramatically, disrupting production schedules. The supply situation worsened with each passing day, and with each new step taken by Canada, a wave of uncertainty and fear grew among American companies. And this was not just an economic crisis, it was a crisis of confidence. Uncertainty in supplies and rising prices, which caused huge losses for large American companies, led analysts to wonder, could Tesla, which had always been considered the flagship of the electric vehicle industry, continue to dominate the market? Expectations for its market value began to plummet, and orders declined despite promises by Elon Musk and his company to introduce the latest technologies. The fall in Tesla's share price was felt by everyone, from investors to ordinary employees.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
Canada also striking back with new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods, mostly steel and aluminum, but also computers and sporting goods.
Elon Musk himself, always open to public statements, was unable to hide his anger and disappointment. He wrote several tweets which, as always, attracted the attention of the world's press. However, his words did little to reassure shareholders. Musk, who had always been able to influence the market with his authority, was unable to regain control of the situation this time. The decline in production rates became apparent, and everyone began to understand that the roots of the problem lay much deeper than a simple supply disruption or product quality issues. In this context, it was in Canada that a real high-stakes game began to unfold. Mark Carney, former head of two major central banks, was in no hurry to make loud statements, but he devised a complex political and economic strategy that led to a sharp reorientation of the Canadian economy. Using bureaucratic tools, Canada did not violate international trade agreements, but it created such economic pressure that it literally destroyed one of the most powerful automotive industries in the world. Carney understood that playing on the side of the world order was no longer profitable. In order for Canada not to be just a geographical neighbor, it had to take on the role of a strategic leader in the new economy that would dominate the future.
Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe, including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, "Of course, I'm going to respond." And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs.
Soon, a few months after the first steps in the economic war, it became clear that the U.S. would no longer dictate the rules of the game in the electric vehicle market. And if the U.S. wasn't going to be the leader, then who would? China and Japan were already preparing to fill the vacant niche, and they weren't going to waste time on old disputes. Against the backdrop of growing trade tensions between the US and Canada, events began to unfold at a remarkable pace. The world's attention was focused on the economic battle that had erupted in the automotive industry. However, it soon became clear that behind the superficial changes in trade tariffs lay something much more serious and strategically calculated. The Canadian government, led by Mark Carney, pushed forward plans that threatened not only American cars, but the entire economic balance of the continent. Canada made a decision that initially appeared to be a minor change in domestic economic policy, but it quickly became clear that these steps were part of a much more ambitious plan. The main focus was on restricting Canadian exports of certain materials and components necessary for automobile production. This was a direct blow to major American manufacturers such as Tesla, General Motors, and Ford, which depended on mineral and component supplies from Canada. But this was only the first step. Soon, the Canadian authorities began to actively use their economic capabilities to slow down and disrupt production processes in the United States without resorting to open military conflict.
outperforming as well in some cases, doing better than Tesla. And you just have to think, how much more is this a sustained issue for Tesla going forward, given the fact that you have Elon Musk, who's been very forthright in his opinions, particularly weighing in on politics, particularly in Europe. We've just had the European elections, which Musk has been very focused on. But across the piece, when you look at the performance for Tesla in Europe, it's not just in small countries. A lot of countries where Tesla has been performing badly, including in Germany, in the UK, where it has been lagging, and Spain as well.
But even that was just the beginning. The Canadian authorities made an unexpected move that exacerbated an already tense situation. The country passed a bill that would impose a 100% tariff on all Tesla vehicles attempting to enter the Canadian market. In response, Canada offered a tax subsidy of $10,000 for each electric vehicle assembled entirely within the country. This move sent shockwaves through the US automotive industry. More importantly, the Canadian government was not just closing the market to Tesla, it was also creating conditions for other American manufacturers, such as Ford and General Motors, to benefit financially from production and sales in Canada. It then became clear that this was not just a trade war, but the beginning of a new model of economic confrontation based on nationalist ideology, which raised questions about who would lead the new era of green technology. Canada realized that the global economy was moving toward environmental sustainability and bet on the fact that, unlike the US, it was capable of effectively adapting its industry to the new conditions. Carney's strategy of incorporating green nationalism into economic policy showed that Canada was ready not only to protect its economy, but also to start rewriting the rules of the game on the global stage.
Well, you will hear people over in Europe say the new Model Y, the Juniper, could be a difference maker, but that's been in that market now for more than a month. And you would think that you would see a greater snapback if it's going to be a difference maker. Look, we could be wrong. It could be a difference maker once you get the sales for April, May, and June. But when you have a country like Norway, I think the sales were down something like 11% there. I mean, that's a very savvy EV consumer in Norway. And that's long been a strength for Tesla. Very small market, not huge volume, but I think almost all of the vehicles they sell there are electric. And they embraced Tesla long before others. And, you know, the reports there are not encouraging.
In response to this economic blow, the US began to look for ways to recover. However, every attempt proved futile. The Canadian model, aimed at supporting domestic production and stimulating national companies, became a global example of how to effectively adapt to the new reality. It soon became clear that America would face an uphill battle to return to the world market, and now it had not only a powerful competitor, but also a new leader, Canada. While the US was trying to cope with the crisis caused by Canada's decisive actions, the global economic map began to change rapidly. What began as a local conflict between two allied countries was now turning into a fundamental shift in global industry. Europe, Asia, and Latin America regions that had previously been oriented toward the American market began to look toward new alliances. The shift in European politics was particularly striking. Germany, which had long been the US's largest partner in the automotive industry, suddenly announced that it was moving its planned Volkswagen plant from Georgia to the Netherlands. The reasons given were unpredictable supply conditions and political instability. In reality, this was a direct admission that the American model of economic management was no longer considered reliable.
Hey Diane, this investigation really just beginning, and one of the key elements will of course be the surveillance video, and investigators potentially have a lot of it to work with as they try to figure out what caused this fire. We know that surveillance footage has been turned over, including video from each of the cars, which could prove vital to understanding what happened here, because each vehicle has its own camera system that works even when the car is off, and 16 cars burned in this fire, and right now investigators don't know what caused it.
France and South Korea signed a new multi-year contract for the supply of lithium-ion batteries, excluding American companies. The UK, which had always been loyal to Washington, announced a review of its climate subsidy program. Cars manufactured in the US were no longer eligible for government support. All this was happening against a backdrop of growing distrust of US policy, and not just in the economy. Terms such as ecological sovereignty and trade pragmatism began to appear in Europe, which essentially meant a departure from the previous blind following of the US. American auto giants such as General Motors and Ford began to lose ground in European markets. Orders were declining, interest in models was waning, and advertising budgets previously directed at Germany, France, and Scandinavia were now being redirected to more loyal regions such as Turkey and India, but even there, interest in American cars was fading. Against this backdrop, Chinese companies began their offensive. BYD, China's largest electric vehicle manufacturer, signed a 25-year agreement with Canadian mining company Northfield Mining to supply cobalt and lithium. Almost simultaneously, the construction of a new battery plant in Mexico, near Monterrey, was announced. 3 weeks later, NIO, another Chinese auto giant, signed a contract with Canadian factory Novacast for the supply of aluminum modules and battery cases. These steps were calculated, precise, and extremely technological. China did not engage in conflict. It simply built infrastructure within North America, exploiting all the loopholes in the USMCA trade agreement. Cars assembled in Canada or Mexico, even if they were 90% Chinese-made, entered the US market with minimal tariffs. It was a move comparable to a chess castling, after which the American defense crumbled.
But they are not ruling out the possibility that this was arson. At the same time, as you just mentioned, there are groups that have been organizing ongoing and peaceful protests at Tesla dealerships around the world. These demonstrations targeting Elon Musk and his affiliation with the Trump administration. Italy's prime minister is said to be close friends with Musk, and there were reports that Teslas have been vandalized in her hometown in Italy. Diane.
Against this backdrop, discussions began about the most dangerous question. Was this a temporary crisis, or was it the end of the American mode of empire? After all, it was not only production that was collapsing before our eyes, but also the very idea that made in the USA was a sign of quality and power. A revaluation of values was taking place in the mass consciousness. People who had been buying cars with American badges for decades now looked at them with suspicion and weariness. Some simply could not afford them. Others did not want to risk investing in unstable brands. Still others switched to leasing or car sharing, and a fourth group started buying bicycles.
KTLA Samantha Cortese joins us live with more on the wave of vandalism in protest of Elon Musk and his role in Washington. Sam?
Hi, Sharon, Micah. The ATF and FBI are collaborating with federal, state, and local law enforcement to investigate acts of domestic terrorism surrounding Teslas.
Experts began to talk about a phenomenon that had seemed impossible until recently, the disappearance of the American auto industry as a dominant force. Not in theory, but in practice. Countries that had previously copied American technology were now beginning to dictate their own terms. The Chinese with their vertical integration and aggressive logistics, the Japanese with their flawless assembly and respect for deadlines, the Canadians with their strategic thinking and control over resources, and the Americans with their debts, abandoned factories, and slogans from the last century. And while politicians argued over terms and ran election campaigns, the world kept moving forward. Without them,